Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we venture into the gilded, suffocating world of royalty, where the greatest threat wasn't always a rival army or a political coup. Tonight you're not just a listener, you're a silent, unseen guest at the courts of kings and queens, a ghost in their grand, echoing halls. You'll be a fly on the wall, witnessing the slow, relentless devastation wrought by a single, insidious disease. A sickness so common it earned a dozen nicknames. The Great White Plague, the King's Evil, the Wasting Sickness. And tonight, you're going to get up close and personal with it. You probably won't survive this. Not in spirit anyway, because you're about to feel the chilling, breathless dread that followed some of Europe's most powerful figures. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what time it is, and we'll share this quiet moment together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the bustling, often unsanitary streets of London in the early 16th century. But your destination isn't the filthy marketplace. Your ghostly feet carry you past the common folk, past the acrid smell of burning coal and unwashed bodies, and right through the gates of Greenwich Palace. This is where you'll begin your story, a tale not of a mighty king's triumph, but of a family's quiet, agonising dissolution. You're heading straight for the nursery, a space that should be filled with laughter and the warmth of a mother's embrace. But here, it's shrouded in a perpetual chill. The year is 1516 and a new life has just been breathed into the world. Princess Mary Tudor, the future Queen Mary I. But even as a newborn, her breath is not her own. It carries the faint telltale sign of a family curse. The air around her is thick with a strange mixture of hope and fear. Her father, King Henry VIII, is a figure of booming laughter and intimidating charisma, but his gaze, when it falls upon his daughter, is laced with a palpable anxiety. He's already lost 2 sons in infancy, and the ghost of their fragile mortality haunts his every thought. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, a woman of deep piety and unyielding strength, whispers prayers over the cradle, her face a mask of worry. The royal physicians, in their pompous velvet and fur, consult in hushed tones, their knowledge a mix of ancient theory and sheer guesswork. They attribute the coughing fits and fevers that will plague young Mary to imbalances of the humours or a cold dampness in the palace air. They couldn't yet fathom the true culprit, a tiny, invisible killer lurking in the very air she breathes, a bacterium known today as Mycobacterium tuberculosis. You watch as Mary, from an early age, is a study in fragility, while other royal children, at least those who survived, were running and tumbling. Mary was often confined to her rooms, a faint flush on her cheeks and a persistent hacking cough in her throat. You see her, a little girl with a sharp, intelligent mind, poring over books, learning Latin and Greek, her intellect developing faster than her body. You see her mother's hands, constantly at her back, shielding her from draughts, bundling her in furs even on mild days. The court, a place of vibrant music and boisterous feasts, becomes a backdrop to Mary's quiet struggle. This constant state of being unwell, this unending cycle of fevers and respiratory infections, is a reality that will define her entire life. It's a reality that today we would recognise in a heartbeat. Back then, it was just Mary's lot in life. Historians still argue whether her chronic poor health was a result of tuberculosis from a very young age, or if it was a series of recurring illnesses that weakened her constitution, making her a perfect host for the disease later. What we know for sure is that her childhood was a masterclass in medical anxiety. You see the physicians' desperation, their concoctions of herbs and strange remedies, like ground pearls and powdered coral, all to no avail. They even tried cures that involved having her breathe the air of cowsheds, a folk remedy believed to be beneficial. It's a slightly ridiculous image, a future queen being wheeled out to a barn, but it highlights the sheer terror and ignorance surrounding the disease. The sheer effort to ward off this unseen enemy was a full-time occupation for her attendants. Her father, King Henry, an obsessive man in matters of succession, viewed Mary's frailty as a personal and dynastic failing. You feel his frustration, his temper flaring as news of her latest bout of illness reaches him. A healthy, robust heir was a king's greatest asset, a guarantee of stability. A sickly daughter was a vulnerability, a source of anxiety that gnawed at his ambition. This anxiety, this relentless hunt for a healthy male heir, is the very thing that will eventually lead to his break with the Catholic Church and his tumultuous series of marriages, but you see it start here, in the quiet despair of a royal nursery. His growing detachment from Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, is not just about a lack of a son, it's about a sickly daughter who represented the fragility of his lineage. You can almost hear the whispered gossip in the palace halls. Courtiers, ever observant and eager for drama, notice the princess's thinness, the way her shoulders seem to slump, the persistent cough she tries so hard to hide with a silk handkerchief. They speak of her pale beauty, a phrase that, in this era, was often a euphemism for the wasting effects of consumption. This quirky tidbit, the romanticisation of the disease's physical effects, the consumptive chic that would later become a trend, is already beginning to take root here. The pale skin, the feverish flush, the glittering eyes, these were not seen as signs of sickness, but of a heightened, almost ethereal beauty. They saw a princess who seemed to be fading away, not in a tragic sense, but in a way that made her seem more delicate, more refined. The Great White Plague, as it was known, wasn't just a physical malady. It was a psychological one. It was a disease of uncertainty, of whispers and shadows. You see how it poisons the atmosphere, how it sets people against each other, as they blame the patient's moral failings or the wrath of God. The more Mary coughed, the more her mother prayed, the more her father despaired, the more the court whispered. The disease becomes a character in its own right, a silent villain in the royal drama, a phantom that moves through the palace, touching one person and sparing another, its motives unknowable, its reach terrifying. As Mary grows older, you see her transition from a sickly child to a determined young woman, but the physical struggle never leaves her. Her face, in portraits, is often painted with a certain pallor, her features sharpened by a life of illness. Her later reign, as the notoriously Bloody Mary, will be defined by a fanatical drive to restore Catholicism, but you can't help but wonder how much of that zeal was fueled by a lifetime of feeling physically vulnerable, of clinging to a faith that felt like the only anchor in a storm of constant sickness. The crown sits heavy on her head, but it is the invisible crown of a chronic disease that she has worn her whole life. The curse, you see, has already begun. You continue to drift through the labyrinthine corridors of the Tudor court, the ghost of Mary's chronic illness still a chill on your skin. But now you find yourself drawn to the source of that great anxiety, her father, the king. The year is no longer 1516, time has slipped forward, and you're now in the 1530s and 40s. King Henry VIII is no longer the strapping, athletic monarch of his youth. His powerful frame has become bloated, his famous charisma often eclipsed by fits of temper and a palpable sense of unease. He is a man haunted by the failure to secure a healthy, undisputed male heir, and you'll soon see how that obsession, coupled with the family's predisposition to illness, will ultimately consume him and those around him. The curse, you realise, is not just a disease, it is a dynasty's downfall, an invisible enemy eating away at the very foundations of the crown. The air in the royal chambers now hangs thick with a different kind of tension. Mary has been declared illegitimate, her mother Catherine cast aside, and the volatile Anne Boleyn has taken her place as queen. You watch as a new princess, Elizabeth, is born, but even she represents a disappointment to the king. Henry's desperate quest for a son has become an all-consuming mania, and he begins to view the sickness that plagues his family not as a medical problem, but as a divine punishment. His leg, once injured in a jousting accident, has become a festering, painful wound, a physical manifestation of the internal rot that seems to be consuming his entire life. The leg ulcer, an open sore that smells of decay and agony, is a daily reminder of his mortality, and it makes him even more sensitive to the signs of sickness in his children. You find yourself observing Jane Seymour, the third Queen, as she gives birth to the long-awaited Prince Edward. A moment of national celebration, yes, but even in this triumph, the shadow of consumption looms large. Jane, a woman who seemed robust and healthy, succumbs to what the physicians call puerperal fever just days after the birth. Today, we know this as a post-birth infection, but in a world with no antibiotics, it was a common and deadly occurrence. However, historians still argue whether Jane's underlying frailty or a pre-existing condition, possibly a form of tuberculosis, contributed to her rapid decline. You can almost hear the frantic whispers of the court, the desperate prayers, the fear that this new, precious heir would be left motherless, vulnerable to the same diseases that had claimed so many royal lives. Henry's joy is mixed with a familiar dread, a sense that even his greatest triumph comes with a price. This is where you see the disease's insidious nature truly take hold. It's not just Mary's chronic cough anymore. It's the king's anxiety, his paranoia, his increasing brutality. He sees illness everywhere, a sign of weakness he despises. He's surrounded by people who are, to a modern eye, clearly suffering from various ailments. His beloved son, Edward, is a sickly, frail child, born into a world where consumption is an ever-present threat. You see Henry's eyes, full of a strange mixture of love and fear, constantly watching his son, searching for any sign of a fever or a cough. The burden of succession weighs on Edward's small shoulders from birth, and his physical fragility is a constant source of stress for his father. This quirky tidbit is often overlooked. Henry VIII's later, more monstrous behaviour wasn't just due to his vanity and power. It was amplified by a deep-seated terror of his dynasty dying out, a fear fuelled by the constant presence of sickness in his family. As Henry ages, his own physical decline accelerates. The leg wound is a constant torment, but you also notice other signs. He becomes short of breath, his coughing fits more frequent. While his official cause of death is a mystery, likely a culmination of obesity and other health issues, many of the symptoms he displayed in his final years, the weakness, the chest pains, the persistent cough, are consistent with what we would now recognise as a late-stage consumptive infection, a disease he may have been carrying for years. The king's evil, as it was sometimes called, was a name given to scrofula, a form of tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, which the king was believed to have the power to heal with a touch. The bitter irony is not lost on you. A king whose family is being slowly destroyed by the very disease he supposedly had the power to cure. The royal court in this period is a breeding ground for such an illness. Crowded palaces, a lack of sanitation, and the constant intermingling of people from all walks of life, from the servants to the nobles, make it easy for the bacterium to spread. The miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells, was the prevailing medical explanation, and so the palace was often filled with pungent herbs and burning frankincense in a futile attempt to ward off the invisible killer. You see the physicians, in their long robes, holding pomanders filled with spices, believing they were protecting themselves from the very air that carried the disease. It's a slightly comical but ultimately tragic image, a desperate attempt to use perfume to fight a bacterium. As Henry's health deteriorates, his grip on power becomes more erratic. The once mighty king, the man who defied the Pope, becomes a prisoner in his own body, his mobility limited, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. You see his face, once so proud and handsome, now a mask of pain and bitterness. He watches his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, from a distance, their relationship fraught with the legacy of his tumultuous marriages. He sees Edward, his heir, a boy who seems to fade a little more each year. The succession is secured, but it is a fragile, uncertain thing, balanced on the shoulders of a sickly child. Remember that constant fear we saw in Mary's childhood. It's now magnified tenfold in her father. His actions, from his brutal treatment of his wives to his dissolution of the monasteries, can be seen, at least in part, as a frantic attempt to control a world that was slipping away from him. He couldn't control disease, he couldn't control death, so he sought to control everything else, the church, the state, his own family, with an iron fist. The anxiety about consumption and the general state of health in the royal family, you realise, is not a side story. It's the driving force behind some of the most significant events of Tudor England. The crown and the curse are inextricably linked, each feeding into the other. As the king's final days approach, you feel the court holding its breath. The physicians, having tried every remedy from powdered mummy to liquid gold, are at a loss. The king is fading, a slow, agonising process that leaves him a shadow of his former self. His death, when it comes, is not a sudden dramatic event, but a quiet, merciful end to years of suffering. But the legacy of consumption, the shadow of the Great White Plague, doesn't die with him. It is passed on, like a dark inheritance, to his son and to his daughters, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode in the next generation of monarchs. The seeds of destruction sown in the nursery of Princess Mary have now taken root in the very heart of the Tudor dynasty. The stage is set for the tragic short reign of a boy king, and you, an unseen observer, are about to witness its heartbreaking conclusion. The heavy, stale air of Henry VIII's final days has dissipated, but the chill of his anxiety remains. You are now a shadow in the halls of power at a pivotal and deeply tragic moment in English history. The year is 1547, and a new king has been crowned. He is a child, a boy of 9 named Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir who, was born under a dark star. His father's death has not brought relief. It has merely shifted the weight of the crown onto the shoulders of a monarch who is physically and emotionally ill-equipped to bear it. The curse, that silent, insidious disease, has now found its most vulnerable and public victim. You observe the young king from a respectful distance. He is a boy of remarkable intelligence, deeply pious, and a keen student of the new Protestant faith his father had so violently established. But what strikes you immediately is his frailty. He is a ghost of a child, with thin limbs, a pale, almost translucent complexion, and a constant dry cough that he tries his best to suppress. He seems to exist in a permanent state of delicate health, a constant source of worry for his regents and a nagging fear for the nation. His tutors are astonished by his intellect, but the physicians in their own little world of herbs and prognostication see a child who is slowly, relentlessly fading. The disease, which we now know as tuberculosis, was a master of disguise. It would lay dormant, only to flare up with a fever, a cough, or a general feeling of malaise. For Edward, these episodes were a constant of his childhood. He had been a sickly child from birth, and his body was in a perpetual battle with an unseen enemy. His doctors, a cohort of well-meaning but ill-informed men, diagnosed him with everything from malaria to smallpox, but they always returned to the same conclusion: an imbalance of the humours. They bled him, they purged him, and they prescribed strange tonics, all of which only served to weaken his already fragile constitution. Historians still argue whether Edward's illness was a pre-existing condition, a childhood bout of consumption, or if his weak immune system made him particularly susceptible to a later infection. What's not in dispute is the public's perception of him. The people who had endured the reign of the tyrannical Henry VIII saw in Edward a glimmer of hope. They saw a pious boy who would lead them into a new, more righteous era. But beneath the hope was a creeping sense of unease. They watched their boy king, so full of promise, grow visibly weaker with each passing year. You feel the collective anxiety of the nation, the whispered fears in the taverns and the marketplaces, the prayers offered for his health in every church. The political ramifications of his poor health were staggering. With no heir and 2 half-sisters, the succession was in constant jeopardy. Edward's advisers, particularly the Duke of Northumberland, became frantic. They knew that if the king died without a male heir, the crown would pass to his half-sister, Mary, a devout Catholic. This would not only reverse the Protestant Reformation, but also dismantle their own power base. You see the intense pressure on the young king, the endless debates about his marriage and the need for him to produce an heir, a conversation that must have seemed both absurd and terrifying to a boy of his age. It's in his last year that the disease truly shows its brutal face. The year is 1552, and Edward begins to exhibit the classic symptoms of tuberculosis. The hacking cough becomes more pronounced and produces blood. He is plagued by fevers and night sweats that leave his linen soaked. His body, already thin, begins to waste away. The royal physicians, now in a state of utter panic, attempt a bizarre and cruel series of treatments. They give him exotic remedies, including something they called arum potabile, or drinkable gold, and a variety of herbal decoctions. In a particularly macabre but true detail, they even fed him a paste made from powdered pearls, believing it had restorative powers. This quirky tidbit is a testament to the desperation and ignorance of the era. They were essentially feeding the dying king an expensive, inert powder. You watch as the boy king, who had once been so vibrant in his faith and his studies, is reduced to a pale, coughing figure, his body covered in sores from the endless rounds of cupping and bleeding. His mind remains sharp, but his body has betrayed him. He knows he is dying. His last act, one of defiance and desperation, is to try and alter the line of succession, writing a will that would disinherit his sisters and place his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. It is a bold, almost reckless move, a last-ditch effort to save his father's Protestant legacy from the impending Catholic restoration. The end comes on July 6th, 1553. Edward VI, the boy king, dies at the age of 15. The official cause of death is recorded as a wasting sickness, or a suppuration of the lungs, both euphemisms for advanced tuberculosis. The death is a shock to the nation, but for those in the inner circles it was an expected, if still tragic, inevitability. The crown, which had passed so cleanly from father to son, is now thrown into chaos. Lady Jane Grey is proclaimed Queen, a reign that will last a mere 9 days before Mary Tudor, Henry's elder daughter, sweeps into London and reclaims her birthright. The short, tragic life of Edward VI is a stark reminder of the consuming power of this disease. It was not just a medical condition, it was a political force, a silent architect of a dynastic crisis. It determined who would rule, what religion the nation would follow, and who would live and die. Edward's story is a heartbreaking microcosm of the broader narrative you're witnessing, that the greatest threat to a royal line wasn't always an outside force, but an internal biological one. The curse, you realise, is not just about individuals, it's about the very fabric of power. It's a reminder that no amount of wealth or privilege could protect you from this one universal killer. As the dust settles on the 9-day reign of Queen Jane, and Mary I takes her place on the throne, you feel the cold hand of the curse on the crown once again, a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. You leave the cold, stone chambers of Tudor England behind and are swept forward in time, across the English Channel, to a world of extravagant lace, gilded furniture, and a new kind of absolute power. Your journey brings you to the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, in the latter half of the 17th century. This is Versailles, a palace of such scale and opulence that it was meant to be a physical manifestation of a king's divinity. But even here, in this palace built to defy all natural limits, the same creeping shadow of consumption that haunted the Tudors has found a home. You're about to witness how the same quiet disease that brought down the Tudors now begins to nibble at the edges of the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Louis XIV, a man of incredible vanity and an unshakable belief in his own greatness, created Versailles not just as a residence but as a cage for his nobility. He wanted to control everything and everyone, to centralise all power in himself. But one thing he could not control was the air, or the microscopic bacteria that floated within it. This era saw a fascination with cleanliness, but it was a cleanliness of appearances. Perfumes masked foul odours, but they did not stop the spread of disease. The palace, for all its glory, was a massive crowded institution, where thousands of courtiers, servants and hangers-on lived in close quarters. It was a perfect breeding ground. You find yourself in the midst of the court, a place of choreographed ritual and relentless gossip. The king is in his prime, a figure of awe and reverence, but you are drawn to a different figure, a quieter, more delicate presence. This is Anne-Marie, Duchesse de Montpensier, a cousin of the king. She's a woman of great wealth and independent spirit, known to the court as La Grande Mademoiselle. But even her lofty status can't protect her. She's one of the many royals whose life is a battle against the wasting sickness. You see the signs in her, the pale skin, the slender frame that seems to lose a little more substance with each passing season, the faint but persistent cough she tries to hide behind a fan. The diagnosis of consumption in this era was often a tragic process of elimination. A doctor would observe a patient's slow decline, the relentless fevers, the loss of appetite, the telltale coughing up of blood, and when all other explanations failed, they would reluctantly concede that the phthisis, as they called it, was a death sentence. There were no cures, only palliatives. The physicians of Versailles, in their powdered wigs and brocade coats, were no more effective than the Tudor doctors. They would prescribe strange remedies, like the drinking of ass's milk, believed to be a restorative tonic, or the application of warm pigeon dung to the patient's chest, a quirky tidbit that, while utterly useless, shows the desperation of the era. They didn't understand the airborne nature of the disease, so they focused on superficial symptoms, all while the deadly bacterium continued its quiet work. The royal family of France, like the Tudors before them, had their own unique susceptibility. You'll recall the close intermarriage between royal houses, a practice meant to solidify power and prevent wars. The unintended consequence, however, was the concentration of certain genetic vulnerabilities. Historians still argue whether consumption was a hereditary disease, a theory that was widely believed at the time, or if the close proximity of family members simply made it easier for the disease to spread. What you observe here is a family where multiple members seem to suffer from the same illness, giving rise to the idea that it was a curse unique to their bloodline. You see this fear play out in the lives of Louis XIV's children and grandchildren. The king's eldest son, Louis, le Grand Dauphin, a man of considerable girth and not so considerable intellect, did not suffer from consumption, but he was a carrier. His wife, Marie-Anne Christine, a shy and introverted Bavarian princess, was not so lucky. She arrived at the French court healthy, but soon after her marriage she began to fade. The court, which had initially found her uninteresting, began to watch her with a new kind of morbid fascination. Her slow, wasting illness, the persistent cough, and the fevers became a public spectacle. The physicians were powerless. She died at the young age of 29, a clear victim of consumption, a stark reminder that even the future Queen of France was not safe from the plague. The fear of contagion was a constant undercurrent in court life. People, while outwardly polite, were deeply wary of those who showed the signs of the disease. They would avoid their touch, their breath, and even the objects they had handled. It was a subtle, almost unspoken ostracism. You see courtiers, with a practiced grace, step away from someone who has just coughed. You see a quiet but palpable sense of relief when someone with the disease is sent away from court, often to a country estate, a polite way of saying they had been exiled to die in peace. For many this was a lonely and terrifying fate, a final abandonment by a society obsessed with health and vigour. Even the king, for all his power, was not immune to this fear. While he was never a consumptive himself, his life was marked by the constant presence of the disease in his family. The death of his daughter-in-law was just the beginning. As you will see in later sections, the disease would claim his grandson and his great-grandson, wiping out nearly 3 generations of heirs in a single, devastating stroke. This created a succession crisis that would echo for decades. The Sun King, who believed he could control the very destiny of France, found himself powerless against a tiny bacterium. As you wander through the endless halls of Versailles, past the Hall of Mirrors, past the perfectly manicured gardens, you realise that all this grandeur is a fragile facade. The mirrors, meant to reflect the endless power of the king, also reflect the paleness of the courtiers and the fevers in their eyes. The gardens, so carefully sculpted, hide the quiet suffering within the palace walls. The disease, you see, is a powerful equaliser. It does not care for titles, for wealth, or for absolute power. It is a slow, relentless and democratic killer, and its presence in the most opulent court in Europe is a testament to its reach. This section ends with the quiet tragedy of Marie-Anne Christine, but it is just the first act of the curse's performance at Versailles. The stage is set for a larger, more devastating drama. The Sun King's reign, for all its brilliance, is already beginning to be overshadowed by the long, dark shadow of the Great White Plague. You feel the chill of the coming tragedy, a chill that even the warm glow of the Sun King's court cannot dispel. The ghost of the Grand Dauphin's wife, Marie-Anne Christine, still lingers in the air of Versailles, a testament to the curse's quiet work. But the story of consumption in the House of Bourbon is far from over. You drift forward in time, past the Sun King's death, into the 18th century, a period of Rococo excess, philosophical enlightenment, and a new kind of whispered danger. The king on the throne is now Louis XV, a man of shifting moods and a deep-seated melancholia. The court is still the most glamorous in Europe, a swirling vortex of silk, scandal, and political intrigue. But beneath the surface, the Great White Plague is continuing its silent, methodical work, proving that even a king's favour couldn't protect you from a tiny bacterium. Louis XV, known as the Beloved, was a more private and reclusive monarch than his great-grandfather. He was a man who loved gardens and botany, finding solace away from the rigid rituals of court life. But even his love of nature and his retreat from public life couldn't shield him, or his family. The Palace of Versailles, while a symbol of France's power, was also a hotbed of disease. Its crowded, often unventilated rooms, the close proximity of thousands of people, and the general lack of modern hygiene made it a perfect incubator. The miasma theory, you'll remember, was still the prevailing belief, so the court's attempts to combat sickness involved more perfume and scented candles than actual sanitation. you find yourself drawn to the story of a particularly tragic figure, Louise Elizabeth, the king's eldest daughter who became Duchess of Parma. She was a vivacious, intelligent young woman, but her life, like so many others in her family, was a brief and sorrowful one. She was married off at the age of 12 to her cousin Philip, the future Duke of Parma, a strategic match meant to solidify France's influence in Italy. You follow her as she leaves the golden halls of Versailles for the colder, more austere palaces of her new home. She's a woman of great charm and wit, but even in Italy she can't escape the shadow that seems to follow her family. Louise Elizabeth's health, a concern even in her youth, began to deteriorate in her late 20s. She was plagued by a persistent cough, a shortness of breath, and a noticeable loss of weight. The doctors of the era, in their ignorance, often saw this wasting as a sign of spiritual purity or a romantic ailment, a quirky and morbid fascination that was part of the culture. They saw her pale, almost ethereal beauty as a sign of her refinement, not as a symptom of a deadly illness. This romanticization of consumption, which would become a major theme in 19th century art and literature, has its roots right here, in the quiet tragedy of figures like Louise Elizabeth. Historians still argue whether her death was purely from consumption or a combination of other factors. What is clear is that her symptoms were a perfect match for the disease that had been plaguing her family for generations. She died at Versailles, where she had returned to visit her father at the age of 32. Her death, while tragic, was just a prelude to a larger, more devastating tragedy that was unfolding within the royal family. It was a stark reminder to the king that his power, his wealth, and his love could not save his children from this invisible killer. This brings you to the story of the Dauphin Louis, Louis XV's only surviving son and the heir to the throne. He was a man of deep piety and intellectual curiosity, a man who, unlike his father, was a devoted husband and father. He was, in many ways, the perfect image of a future king. But even he was not immune to the family curse. The Dauphin too was a victim of the Great White Plague. You see him, a man of quiet dignity, slowly succumbing to the disease that had already taken his sister. His health had always been a concern, but in the early 1760s his condition worsened dramatically. He was plagued by a relentless cough and a general feeling of weakness that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. The doctors, with their usual mixture of superstition and ineffective remedies, were once again at a loss. They bled him, they gave him concoctions of herbs and mineral waters, but nothing could stop the slow, inexorable march of the disease. The court, which had been so obsessed with its own petty intrigues, was forced to confront the reality of the Dauphin's impending death. You feel the palpable sense of dread, the silent prayers of a nation hoping for a miracle that would never come. The Dauphin's death in 1765 at the age of 36 was a catastrophic blow to the monarchy. It meant that the succession would now pass to his young son, the future Louis XVI, a boy who was too young and too unprepared to inherit the most powerful throne in Europe. The death of the Dauphin Louis was a turning point. It was a clear and devastating sign that the Bourbon dynasty was not as invincible as it seemed. The crown, which Louis XIV had so carefully cultivated, was now in the hands of a young, inexperienced boy. The stability and succession that had been so carefully planned were now in shambles, all because of a single disease. This is a mainstream historical fact, but its true emotional weight, the sheer terror of it for the court and the nation, is often lost in the history books. The death of the Dauphin was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis of the highest order, a silent prelude to the French Revolution that would follow just 2 decades later. The quiet suffering of these royals, hidden behind the gilded walls and lavish parties, is a stark contrast to the public image of power and invincibility. You see it in the hushed conversations, the worried glances, the way the king himself seemed to shrink in the face of his family's tragedies. He, the most powerful man in Europe, was powerless to stop the slow, methodical destruction of his own family. The whispers in the halls of Versailles, once about scandal and court intrigue, now had a new and more sinister subject: death. The curse was at its work, quietly and efficiently, undermining the very foundation of the French monarchy, one royal at a time. As you leave the glittering halls of Versailles, you carry with you the images of Louise Elizabeth and the Dauphin Louis, 2 bright lights extinguished too soon. Their deaths, both from consumption, are not just footnotes in a history book. They are key moments in the long tragic narrative of a dynasty slowly being eaten away from the inside. The stage is now set for the next chapter, where the same disease will claim its next victims, in a different court, in a different country, but with the same devastating results. The gilded tragedy of Versailles is now a distant memory. You have left behind the powdered wigs and the whispers of the Bourbon court, and are now travelling to a colder, more sombre corner of Europe, the Kingdom of Prussia in the late 18th century. The air here is less scented with perfume, and more with the crispness of a northern climate, but the underlying threat remains the same. You find yourself in the city of Potsdam, a place of military precision and intellectual rigour under the reign of King Frederick the Great. But even a ruler known for his iron will and strategic genius could not protect his family from the unseen enemy that was consumption. The curse you'll see is not confined to one royal house or one kingdom. It is a pandemic in slow motion, a universal killer with a cruel and indiscriminate hand. Your focus now shifts to a young couple, Princess Louise of Prussia and her husband, Prince Karl. Their story is not one of political intrigue or grand ambition, but of a quiet, profound love tragically cut short. They were married in 1793, a time of great upheaval in Europe with the French Revolution in full swing. But for them, the world was a small, intimate one, centred on their home and their burgeoning family. They were a bright, vibrant couple, known for their deep affection and mutual respect. You feel the warmth of their love, a stark contrast to the often cold, arranged marriages of the era. But even this warmth could not ward off the chilling touch of the disease. Princess Louise, in her early 20s, began to show the familiar signs of the Great White Plague. She was a woman of delicate beauty, with a slender frame and a kind, gentle disposition, but her health was always a concern. The doctors of the era, while slightly more advanced than their Tudor counterparts, were still largely helpless. They had begun to understand that the disease was not an imbalance of the humours, but a pestilence of the lungs. However, their treatments were still largely based on rest, fresh air, and a nutritious diet, which were, in fairness, the best they could offer. But for an advanced case, these measures were little more than delaying the inevitable. You watch as her health deteriorates. The initial signs, a persistent hacking cough, become more pronounced. The fevers, which at first were occasional, now become a daily torment, leaving her weak and exhausted. The telltale flush of consumption, a crimson spot on her otherwise pale cheeks, is now a permanent feature of her face. Her husband, Prince Karl, is utterly devoted to her. You see him at her bedside, holding her hand, reading to her, his face a mask of grief and helplessness. He tries everything, from consulting the best doctors in Europe to seeking out folk remedies, but nothing helps. The doctors, in their polite roundabout way, let him know that there is no hope. Historians still argue about the exact strain of tuberculosis that afflicted the family. It was a well-known fact that the disease was rampant in Prussia, particularly in the crowded cities and among the poor. What's not in dispute is the devastating effect it had on the royal family. The death of Princess Louise in 1801 at the age of 24 was a profound personal tragedy for her husband, and a national one for Prussia. She was beloved by the people for her kindness and grace, and her death was mourned by many. You see the procession, a sombre affair with a long line of black-clad mourners, a testament to the love and respect she commanded. But the curse, as you've learned, rarely stops with a single victim. It tends to strike at a family, moving from one person to another with a chilling efficiency. You now observe her husband, Prince Karl, in the aftermath of her death. He is a broken man, consumed by grief. He had lost the love of his life, and now he begins to show the same signs of the disease that had claimed his wife. The relentless cycle of fevers, the coughing, the wasting of his body. It's a heartbreaking echo of his wife's final months. His grief, you realise, has not only weakened his will to live, but also made him more susceptible to the disease. This brings up a fascinating and often debated aspect of consumption, the emotional toll. The idea that a broken heart or a period of profound grief could make you more susceptible to the disease was a widely held belief at the time. A quirky tidbit, perhaps, but there's a grain of truth in it. Modern science now tells us that extreme stress can suppress the immune system, making a person more vulnerable to infection. So, while a broken heart couldn't directly cause consumption, it could certainly create the conditions for it to take hold. Prince Karl, in his profound sadness, was the perfect host for the disease that had already taken his beloved. You see his children, now motherless, watching their father fade away. The tragedy is cyclical, a cruel mirror image of their mother's death. He would not last long after her. The prince died in 1806, just 5 years after his wife, at the age of 42. His death left his 2 young sons, Friedrich and Wilhelm, orphaned. The loss of both parents, one after the other, in such a short span of time, was a devastating blow to the family and a clear signal that the curse was now a permanent feature of the Prussian royal house. The story of Louise and Karl is not a tale of a monarch's downfall, but of a dynasty's quiet, personal suffering. It's a reminder that beneath the pomp and circumstance, royals were just people, vulnerable to the same diseases that afflicted the common man. Their love story, which should have been a source of strength and continuity for the Prussian crown, became a tragic footnote, a tale of 2 star-crossed lovers whose lives were consumed by a sickness they couldn't fight. The curse, you'll see, has now infiltrated the major royal houses of Europe, a slow and methodical killer that is laying the groundwork for a series of tragedies that will change the course of history. As you leave the sombre halls of the Prussian court, you carry with you the image of Prince Karl, a man so broken by grief that he seemed to welcome the same disease that had killed his wife. Their story is a powerful and heart-wrenching illustration of the human cost of the Great White Plague, a cost that was paid not just in a single life, but in the slow, agonizing destruction of a family. The curse is spreading, and its next victim will be found in the glittering and often brutal court of the Russian Tsars. The stage is set for a new kind of tragedy, one that is as much about political paranoia as it is about personal suffering. The mournful silence of the Prussian court gives way to the thunderous splendour of Imperial Russia. You are now a spectre at the heart of the Romanov dynasty in the early 19th century, a world of extravagant balls, ruthless political manoeuvring, and a royal family whose vast power could not protect them from the curse. You arrive at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Petersburg, a place of gilded halls and endless ceremony, where Tsar Alexander I, a man of shifting alliances and deep spiritual convictions, holds court. But your focus is not on the Tsar, but on his sister, Grand Duchess Alexandra Pavlovna, and her tragic brief life, a story that perfectly illustrates how the royal curse of consumption was now a global phenomenon, striking at the very core of Europe's most powerful families. Alexandra Pavlovna was a young woman of remarkable beauty and a gentle, compassionate nature. She was the Tsar's favourite sister, and her life was shaped by the geopolitical ambitions of her family. In 1799, at the tender age of 16, she was married to Archduke Joseph of Austria, a key alliance meant to strengthen ties between Russia and the Habsburg Empire. You see her, a young bride, leaving the familiar comforts of the Russian court for the more rigid and formal life in Hungary, a life that would prove to be a short and painful one. The marriage, while a political triumph for her family, was a personal tragedy for her. She was met with suspicion and hostility from her mother-in-law, the Empress Maria Ludovica, a woman known for her cold and xenophobic nature. The Empress, who was fanatically religious, saw Alexandra's Orthodox faith as a sign of her otherness and actively tried to convert her to Catholicism. This emotional and spiritual torment took a heavy toll on the young Grand Duchess. She was isolated, lonely, and under immense pressure to assimilate into a court that rejected her. It was in this state of profound unhappiness and stress that the familiar symptoms of the royal curse began to appear. A persistent dry cough, a loss of appetite, and a slow, wasting away of her once vibrant beauty. The physicians of the court, a mix of Russian and Austrian doctors, were at a loss. They, like their counterparts in other European courts, had no clear understanding of the disease. They attributed her illness to the unhealthy climate of Hungary, a lack of fresh air, and the general stress of her life. Historians still argue about the precise cause of her death, with some attributing it to complications from childbirth, while others believe it was a clear case of consumption, exacerbated by the stress and hostility of her new home. What is not in dispute is the fact that she was a young woman with a delicate constitution who was slowly being eaten away by a wasting sickness. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Romanovs, while a powerful dynasty, were not immune to the spectre of consumption. Many members of the family suffered from the disease, and it was a source of constant anxiety for the Tsar. The disease, you see, did not discriminate based on political power or military might. It was a silent democratic killer and its presence in the Romanov family was a chilling reminder of their own mortality. A quirky tidbit from the time is that the Russian court, in its attempts to combat the disease, would often send consumptive royals to Italy, a country believed to have a more healing climate. The idea was that the warm sun and fresh air of the Mediterranean could somehow cleanse the lungs and restore a person's health. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. You see Alexandra's final days, a heartbreaking tableau of a young woman fading away in a foreign land. She was pregnant with her first child, and the added strain of pregnancy only accelerated her decline. The court, which had been so hostile to her, now watched her with a morbid fascination. The Empress, her mother-in-law, even in this moment of tragedy, was more concerned with her religious conversion than with her physical comfort. Alexandra, in her final moments, clung to her orthodox faith, a last act of defiance against a world that had rejected her. She died on March 16th, 1801, just 2 weeks after giving birth to a stillborn daughter at the age of 17. Her death was a shock to both the Russian and Austrian courts, a tragedy that would haunt her brother, the Tsar, for the rest of his life. The death of Alexandra Pavlovna was more than just a personal loss. It was a political crisis. Her husband, Archduke Joseph, was so distraught by the loss that he would later claim his mother-in-law's cruelty and the stress of the court were the real causes of his wife's death, a sentiment that would strain relations between Russia and Austria for years. The curse, you see, was not just a biological reality. It was a political force, a silent agitator that could undermine diplomatic alliances and create lasting resentment between nations. The death of one young princess so far from home had a ripple effect that was felt across the continent. The story of Grand Duchess Alexandra Pavlovna is a poignant reminder of the vulnerability of even the most powerful royals. She was a pawn in a political game, a young woman who was sent to a hostile court and slowly consumed by a disease that no one understood. Her life, though brief, is a testament to the cruelty of an era that had no defence against the Great White Plague. The curse had now infiltrated the Romanov dynasty, and it would continue to claim victims for the next 2 centuries, a dark thread that would run through the history of one of Europe's most powerful and ultimately doomed families. As you leave the cold, formal halls of the Habsburg court, you carry with you the image of a young Grand Duchess, a stranger in a strange land, whose life was consumed by a disease that was as much a product of her loneliness and isolation as it was of a microscopic bacterium. Her story is a heartbreaking prelude to the larger, more devastating tragedies that are yet to come. The stage is set for the curse to claim its next victims, this time in the very heart of the British Empire, at the court of the formidable Queen Victoria. The disease, you'll see, respects no borders, no titles, and no royal houses. It is a universal killer, and its reach is long and cruel. The vast frozen expanse of Imperial Russia recedes, and you're now a guest at the heart of the most powerful empire the world has ever known. It is the late 19th century, the era of Queen Victoria, a time of immense industrial progress and a rigid, almost suffocating moral code. You're at Windsor Castle, a place of immense power and historical weight. But even here, in the very stronghold of the British Empire, the royal curse is still at work. Your focus now shifts to one of Victoria's 9 children, Princess Alice, a woman of deep compassion and remarkable strength, whose life was a series of personal tragedies, all of them tied in some way to the relentless grip of consumption. Princess Alice was in many ways the emotional centre of the family. She was a dedicated nurse to her father, Prince Albert, in his final illness, and a source of comfort to her mother, the grieving Queen Victoria, in the years after his death. She was a woman of intelligence, with a deep interest in social reform and a progressive attitude toward public health. In a quirky tidbit from the era, she was one of the first royals to champion the use of disinfectants in hospitals, and was a fierce advocate for nursing as a respectable profession. She saw the suffering of the poor and was determined to do something about it. But even with all her compassion and progressive ideas, she could not escape the shadow of the disease that had haunted so many of her royal predecessors. Alice's life was marked by a series of personal losses, but the most devastating was the death of her son, Prince Friedrich, who died from an injury after falling from a window, a death that many historians believe was made more likely due to his haemophilia, a genetic condition that plagued many of Victoria's descendants. It was in the aftermath of this tragedy that Alice began to show the telltale signs of the royal curse. She was a woman of immense emotional strength, but the cumulative stress and grief from her father's death and her son's accident began to take a toll on her physically. You see her, a woman in her prime, slowly begin to fade. The familiar cough, the pallor, the loss of weight, all of them signs of a slow, wasting illness. Her husband, the Grand Duke Louis IV of Hesse, was a devoted partner, but he was powerless to stop the slow march of the disease. The doctors of the era, more advanced than their counterparts in previous centuries, had a better understanding of tuberculosis. They knew it was a contagious disease, and they began to advocate for sanatoriums, fresh air, and proper nutrition as a form of treatment. But for Princess Alice, these treatments were largely ineffective. The disease had already taken hold, and it was a relentless, methodical killer. You can almost feel the stifling sense of inevitability that surrounded her. She was a woman who had given so much of her life to caring for others, and now, in her greatest hour of need, there was no one who could save her. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the royal families of Europe were a tangled web of marriages and alliances, all descended from a few key figures. This close intermarriage had the unintended consequence of spreading not just haemophilia, but also a genetic predisposition to various diseases, including consumption. Princess Alice, through her mother, was a carrier of the haemophilia gene, and her family tree was riddled with other health issues. Historians still argue whether her consumption was a result of this genetic predisposition, or if she contracted the disease from one of her many public engagements, where she came into contact with the poor and the sick. The truth, you realise, is likely a combination of both. She was both genetically vulnerable and a woman of immense compassion who often put herself in harm's way for the sake of others. The final tragedy in Alice's life came in 1878, when a diphtheria epidemic swept through her household. One by one, her children fell ill. Her youngest daughter, Princess Marie, died, a heartbreaking loss that devastated the family. Alice, ever the devoted mother, nursed her surviving children through the illness. It was during this time that she broke one of the cardinal rules of the era. She gave her sick son, Prince Ernest, a kiss to comfort him. It was a simple act of maternal love, but it was, in many ways, her death sentence. She too contracted diphtheria and died just a few weeks later. But her death certificate, you realise, tells a more complicated story. Many medical historians now believe that her diphtheria, while a contributing factor, was the final blow to a body that had already been ravaged by consumption. Her immune system, weakened by the slow, wasting illness, simply couldn't fight off the new infection. The death of Princess Alice was a profound shock to Queen Victoria and the entire nation. She was, in many ways, the good princess, the one who was a source of comfort and stability. Her death on the 17th anniversary of her father's passing seemed to have a cruel, almost poetic symmetry. It was a clear and public reminder that the royal family, for all their power and privilege, was not immune to the diseases that plagued the rest of the world. The curse, you realise, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonising destruction of a family, a series of tragedies that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. As you leave the quiet, sombre rooms of Windsor Castle, you carry with you the image of Princess Alice, a woman whose life was a testament to both love and tragedy. Her story is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was a personal and deeply painful reality for the people who lived it. It was a story of a woman who gave her life to caring for others, only to be consumed by a disease that she had fought so hard to combat. The stage is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you to the heart of the Habsburg Empire, to a family known for its beauty, its power, and its tragic, almost Shakespearean fate. The curse, you'll see, is now operating on an even larger, more mysterious stage, one that will leave a trail of death and speculation that continues to this day. You leave the sombre halls of Windsor, the grief for Princess Alice a quiet echo in your mind, and are once again a ghost in the annals of royal tragedy. This time, your journey takes you to the heart of the Habsburg Empire, to the glittering, and often morbid, court of Vienna in the late 19th century. This is the era of Empress Elizabeth, the legendary Sisi, a woman of breathtaking beauty and a deep, all-consuming melancholy, and her son, Crown Prince Rudolph. Their story is a complex web of romance, political intrigue, and a final horrifying act of violence at a hunting lodge in Meyerling. But beneath the layers of scandal and suicide, the familiar hand of consumption, the royal curse you've been tracing may have played a silent but crucial role. Crown Prince Rudolf was, on the surface, a man of intellect and liberal ideas, a stark contrast to his conservative father, Emperor Franz Joseph. He was a gifted ornithologist, a curious mind who chafed against the rigid confines of court life. But you see, beneath the surface, he was a deeply troubled soul. He was a man with a fragile constitution, prone to fits of depression and a general state of ill health. The court physicians, in their grand and elaborate fashion, often diagnosed him with a variety of ailments, from nerve disorders to melancholia. But you, an unseen observer with the knowledge of past centuries, see the familiar signs of the wasting sickness. A persistent cough, a certain pallor to his skin, and a restless, feverish energy that seemed to consume him from the inside out. Rudolf was, by all accounts, a man who lived on the edge. He was a frequent visitor to the brothels of Vienna, a bohemian who drank heavily and took to a life of debauchery as a way to escape the suffocating pressures of his role as heir. A mainstream historical fact is that his lifestyle made him susceptible to a variety of diseases, and it's widely believed that he contracted a venereal disease, which would have weakened his immune system and made him a prime candidate for a consumptive infection. The two, you realise, were often linked in the popular imagination of the time. The wasting effects of one were often confused with the other, and the two together would have created a devastating cocktail of illness. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was a political necessity, but it was not a happy one. He was a man who craved intellectual and emotional connection, and he found it, not in his wife, but in a series of mistresses, the last and most famous of whom was the 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera. It was with Mary that he found a fleeting moment of happiness, a respite from the pressures of his life, but it was a happiness that was doomed from the start. She was a young woman who was also caught in the web of court intrigue, and their relationship was a scandal that threatened to engulf the entire royal family. The final act of this tragedy unfolded at the Royal Hunting Lodge of Meyerling in January of 1889. The official story, a carefully constructed piece of political theatre, was that the Crown Prince had died of a heart failure, and that Mary had died with him, her death an unfortunate accident. But the whispers of the court, the ones you can still hear, tell a different story. The story, as it has come down to us, is that Rudolf shot his mistress and then took his own life, a double suicide born of a love that could not be. But what if there was more to the story? What if the royal curse played a role in this final desperate act? Historians still argue whether Rudolf was in the advanced stages of consumption at the time of his death. The symptoms he exhibited, the constant coughing, the fever, the nervous exhaustion, are all consistent with a man in the grip of the disease. A quirky tidbit, however, is that his doctors, in their post-mortem, tried to cover up the true extent of his illness, both physical and mental, to save the reputation of the royal family. They wanted to portray him as a man who died suddenly, not as a man who was slowly and agonizingly consumed by disease and despair. The truth, you realise, was too ugly for the court to bear. The possibility of Rudolf being a consumptive adds a new layer of tragedy and desperation to the Meyerling incident. Imagine a man, a crown prince, who knows he is dying, a man who is trapped in a loveless marriage and a life he despises, a man who is being slowly eaten away by a disease that has plagued his family for centuries. His final act, a murder-suicide, may not have been a sudden fit of passion, but a planned and desperate act of a man who saw no other way out. It was a man who was already living on borrowed time, a man who was already a ghost. The fallout from Meyerling was immense. The Empress Elizabeth, a woman who already had a fragile grasp on reality, was utterly devastated. She would spend the rest of her life in a state of mourning, a black-clad ghost who wandered the palaces of Europe, a victim of her son's death and the cruel, unrelenting pressure of her royal life. Her son's death would also throw the succession into crisis, a familiar theme in the story you're following. The throne would eventually pass to his cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man whose assassination in 1914 would be the final, cataclysmic act that would plunge Europe into the First World War. The Meyerling incident, you realise, is not just a salacious scandal. It is a key moment in the long, tragic narrative of the royal curse. It is a story of a man whose life was consumed by despair and disease, a story that would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of human history. The curse, you see, had now moved from the personal to the geopolitical, a silent force that was undermining the very foundations of the European world. As you leave the hunting lodge, the scent of death still hangs in the air. The final act has been played out, but the tragedy, you realise, is far from over. The curse is now on the Spanish sceptre, and its next victims are a family that is in many ways an echo of the Tudors, a family plagued by intermarriage, illness, and a final desperate struggle for survival. The tragic echoes of Mayerling fade, and you are now a witness to a new, and in many ways more persistent tragedy. Your journey takes you to the court of Spain in the late 19th century, a kingdom that, for all its pomp and ancient lineage, was struggling to modernise. The royal curse of consumption, you will see, was particularly devastating here, not just because of the disease itself, but because it was intertwined with centuries of inbreeding and a series of fragile, often sickly heirs. The Spanish royal house, the House of Bourbon, was a mirror image of the Tudors, a family plagued by intermarriage, illness, and a final, desperate struggle for survival. The crown, you'll see, was a heavy burden, made all the more so by the constant presence of an invisible killer. Your focus is on King Alfonso XII of Spain, a man who came to the throne in 1874 after years of political instability. He was a popular and charismatic monarch, but his life was a testament to the cruelties of the era's medical knowledge and the persistent threat of consumption. He was, by all accounts, a man of delicate health, a fact that was of constant concern to his court and his nation. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Spanish royal family had a long and tragic history of ill health, a direct result of their practice of marrying within their own family and other closely related European royal houses. This close intermarriage, while meant to consolidate power, had the unintended consequence of concentrating genetic vulnerabilities, making them particularly susceptible to a range of diseases, including tuberculosis. Alfonso XII's first wife, Mercedes of Orléans, was a bright and vivacious young woman who captured the hearts of the Spanish people. Their love story was the stuff of fairy tales, a rare, genuine romance in a world of arranged marriages. But their happiness was short-lived. Just 5 months after their wedding, Mercedes fell ill. The physicians, with their usual blend of superstition and limited knowledge, diagnosed her with typhus, but the reality was far more insidious. Her symptoms, the high fevers, the relentless cough, the rapid wasting away of her body, were a textbook case of what we now know as tuberculosis. You see, the young king, utterly distraught at her bedside, a man powerless to save the love of his life. She died in 1878 at the age of 18, a victim of the same disease that had plagued so many other royals. Her death was a national tragedy, and it plunged the young king into a state of profound grief. His grief, however, was not to last. The duty of the crown was paramount. The Spanish monarchy needed an heir, a fact that was hammered home by his advisers and the nation. So, less than a year after his first wife's death, Alfonso XII married Princess Maria Cristina of Austria. She was a woman of quiet strength and deep devotion, and she would prove to be a stabilising force in the king's life. But even with a new queen and the birth of 2 daughters, the spectre of consumption never left the palace. A quirky tidbit from this time is that the doctors of the court, in their desperation, tried a variety of bizarre and ineffective remedies. One such remedy was mountain air, a belief that the thin, clean air of the mountains could somehow cure the disease. The king and his court would often be sent to the mountains for extended periods, a practice that was more of a polite form of exile than a medical treatment. They also tried to purify the air of the palace with strong perfumes and burning herbs, all in a futile attempt to ward off an invisible enemy they couldn't comprehend. The sheer effort and expense that went into these rituals were a testament to their fear and ignorance. But the disease, you see, was already a part of the king himself. Alfonso XII, a man who had watched his first wife die from consumption, began to show the same symptoms. The relentless cough, the fevers, the loss of weight, all of them were there. His advisers, in a desperate attempt to protect the monarchy, tried to keep his illness a secret. They would tell the public that he was suffering from a variety of minor ailments, but the truth was an open secret. The king was a man who was fading before their very eyes. Historians still argue about the exact cause of his death, with some claiming it was dysentery or influenza, but the majority of evidence points to advanced tuberculosis. The disease, you realise, was a slow, agonising killer, and it would have been a long, painful death for the king. He died in 1885 at the age of 27, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. His death plunged Spain into a succession crisis. His posthumous son, the future Alfonso XIII, was born 6 months after his death. This meant that the country would be ruled by a regent, his widow, for 16 years. The death of one man, a man consumed by the royal curse, had once again thrown an entire nation into a state of political uncertainty. The tragedy of Alfonso XII is a powerful illustration of the cyclical nature of the royal curse. It was a disease that ran in families, a slow and methodical killer that seemed to move from one generation to the next. The Spanish royal family, with its history of close intermarriage, was a prime example of this. The curse was not just a medical problem, it was a political one. It was a disease that could destabilise a nation, plunge it into crisis, and leave a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. As you leave the Palace of Madrid, the memory of Alfonso XII and his young wife still lingers. Their love story, so bright and beautiful, was a small flame that was snuffed out by a disease that no one could understand. Their tragedy is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you back to the British Empire, to a prince who seemed to have everything, only to be consumed by the same invisible killer. The curse is spreading, and its reach, you'll see, is now global. The tragic echoes of the Spanish court fade, and you're once again swept across the continent, back to the heart of the British Empire. It is now the turn of the 1890s, the twilight of the Victorian era, a time of immense power and global reach. You're a silent observer at Sandringham House, the private Norfolk estate of the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and Queen Alexandra. The family is celebrating Christmas, a time of festive cheer and family gatherings. But even here, in this seemingly idyllic setting, the curse is at work. Your focus is on the Queen's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, a man whose life was a series of scandals and unanswered questions, and whose death in a remote corner of the world would forever be shrouded in the spectre of consumption. Albert Victor, known to his family as Eddie, was the eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and the heir presumptive to the British throne after his father. He was, by all accounts, a man of limited intelligence and a weak constitution. He was also, a mainstream historical fact, a figure of immense public fascination and a constant source of anxiety for his family. His life was a magnet for scandal, from a notorious brothel scandal in London to rumours of a romantic entanglement with a commoner that produced an illegitimate child. But it was his health, you'll see, that was the most persistent and ultimately fatal problem. He was a man who, like so many of his royal predecessors, was slowly being consumed from the inside out. His life, you realise, was a battle against a series of ailments. He suffered from a variety of chronic health issues, and his body seemed to be in a perpetual state of fragility. The physicians of the era, while more advanced in their understanding of diseases like tuberculosis, were still largely helpless. They had begun to understand that the disease was contagious, but they had no effective treatments beyond rest, fresh air, and a healthy diet. For a man like Albert Victor, whose life was one of public duty and constant travel, these were not always easy to come by. A quirky tidbit from this time is that the royal family, in a desperate attempt to improve his health, sent him on a world tour, a journey that took him to Egypt, India, and a variety of other far-flung corners of the empire. The idea, you'll remember from previous sections, was that the warm sun and clean air of these exotic locations would somehow cleanse his lungs and restore his health. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. His journey, while a diplomatic success for the British Empire, was a personal failure for him. He returned from his travels no healthier than he had left, and the curse, you realise, was still at work. His final illness came in 1892, just a few weeks after his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck. He was at Sandringham for a family gathering, and he fell ill with a fever. The doctors, in their usual fashion, diagnosed him with influenza, but the reality, as it would later become clear, was far more sinister. His condition quickly deteriorated, and he was soon plagued by the familiar symptoms of consumption, a relentless cough, a high fever, and a gradual but irreversible wasting away of his body. His death, which came just a few weeks later at the age of 28, was a profound shock to the nation and a devastating blow to the royal family. The official cause of death was influenza, but historians still argue whether his underlying condition was tuberculosis, a disease that had been slowly consuming him for years. The fact is that influenza was a common diagnosis for a variety of respiratory illnesses, and it would have been a convenient way for the royal family to hide the true cause of his death. A death from consumption would have been a source of immense shame for the royal family, a clear sign that they were not immune to the diseases that plagued the rest of the world. So, they chose to hide it, a quiet cover-up that would leave a trail of unanswered questions and conspiracy theories that continue to this day. The death of Albert Victor was a pivotal moment in British history. It meant that his younger brother, Prince George, the future King George V, would now be the heir to the throne. It was a twist of fate, a stroke of good fortune for a man who was, by all accounts, a far more stable and reliable figure than his older brother, but for the royal family it was a tragedy of the highest order. They had lost their heir, a man who, despite his flaws, was a beloved member of the family. The curse, you see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a family, a series of tragedies that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The story of Albert Victor is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was a personal and deeply painful reality for the people who lived it. It was a story of a man whose life was a series of battles, a man who was in many ways a ghost even before his death. His life, so full of promise, was snuffed out by a disease that no one could understand. His death, a tragic moment in British history, was a clear and public reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. As you leave the grounds of Sandringham, the scent of pine and crisp winter air still lingers. The memory of Albert Victor, the prince who was lost to the sands of time, is a powerful reminder of the human cost of the Great White Plague. The curse, you'll see, has now returned to the heart of the Habsburg Empire, to a prince who seemed to have everything, only to be consumed by the same invisible killer. The stage is set for the next chapter, one that will take you to a world of immense privilege and a final heartbreaking tragedy. You have left the fog-laden air of Sandringham and the tragic memory of Albert Victor behind, and are now once again a silent observer in the opulent but ultimately tragic world of the Habsburgs. It is the mid-19th century, a time of grand empires and even grander tragedies. Your journey takes you to the court of Emperor Franz Joseph, the same monarch whose son, Rudolf, would later meet his tragic end at Mayerling. But your focus is on a different member of this ill-fated family. Archduke Maximilian of Austria, a man of immense privilege and even greater ambition, whose life would take him from the gilded halls of Vienna to a firing squad in Mexico, all while being consumed by the same invisible killer that had plagued his family for centuries. Maximilian was, by all accounts, the perfect prince. He was handsome, charming, and intelligent, a man of liberal ideas who, like his cousin Rudolf, chafed against the rigid conservatism of the Austrian court. He was a gifted botanist and a lover of art, a man who seemed destined for greatness. But even in his youth you, a silent observer with the knowledge of past centuries, see the familiar signs of the royal curse. A certain frailty, a susceptibility to illness, and a cough that, while not yet persistent, was a nagging reminder of the family's tragic history. He was, in many ways, a mirror image of his more famous brother, a man who was destined for a life of both triumph and tragedy. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Habsburg family was a tangled web of marriages and alliances, a practice that had the unintended consequence of spreading not just political power, but also a genetic predisposition to a variety of diseases. Maximilian, through his mother, was a direct descendant of the Spanish Habsburgs, a family, you'll remember from previous sections, that was decimated by consumption. This close intermarriage, while meant to consolidate power, had the tragic consequence of making the family particularly susceptible to the Great White Plague. Maximilian, you realise, was a man with a target on his back from birth, a man whose genetic inheritance was both a blessing and a curse. His life took a dramatic turn in 1864 when he accepted the offer from Napoleon III of France to become the Emperor of Mexico. It was a grand and ultimately foolhardy ambition. Mexico was in a state of political turmoil, and the French intervention was a deeply unpopular one. Maximilian, a man who had dreamed of a liberal modern monarchy, was stepping into a nightmare. You see him, a man of immense charm and a deep sense of duty, arriving in Mexico with his wife, Empress Carlota, a woman of fierce intelligence and even greater ambition. They were in many ways a fairy tale couple, but their fairy tale was destined for a brutal and bloody end. The disease, which had been a quiet companion in his life, now began to take a more active role. The stress of the Mexican climate, the political turmoil, and the constant threat of assassination all took a heavy toll on his health. He was plagued by fevers and a persistent dry cough that, was a telltale sign of his underlying illness. The doctors, in their desperation, diagnosed him with a variety of ailments, but the truth, as it would later become clear, was far more sinister. Maximilian was a man who was slowly and agonizingly being consumed by tuberculosis, a disease that, like the political situation in Mexico, was eating him away from the inside out. A quirky tidbit from this time is that Maximilian, in his desperation to find a cure, became a fervent believer in the healing powers of the Mexican climate. He would spend long periods of time in the mountains, a practice that, while a beautiful and peaceful retreat, was utterly ineffective in combating the disease. He believed that the warm sun and the clean air would somehow cleanse his lungs and restore his health. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. His life, you realise, was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. The end came in 1867. The French had withdrawn their support, and Maximilian was left to face the forces of the Mexican Republic alone. He was captured, and despite pleas for his life from across Europe, he was executed by a firing squad. His death was a profound shock to his family and the nations of Europe, but his death certificate, you realise, tells a more complicated story. Many medical historians now believe that his tuberculosis, while not the direct cause of his death, was a major contributing factor. His body, weakened by the disease, would have been a poor match for the stress and hardship of his final months. He was in many ways a man who was already a ghost even before his execution. Historians still argue about the exact role that consumption played in his life. What is clear is that he was a man who was always living on the edge, a man whose life was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. His story is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was a global phenomenon, a disease that could follow you from the gilded halls of Vienna to the firing squad in Mexico. The curse, you see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a man, a series of tragedies that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. As you leave the sombre courtyard where Maximilian met his end, you carry with you the image of a man whose life was a testament to both ambition and tragedy. His story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you back to Imperial Russia, to a family that was, in many ways, the culmination of all the tragedies you have witnessed. A family plagued by intermarriage, illness, and a final, brutal end. The curse is spreading, and its reach, you'll see, is now global. The final tragic memory of Archduke Maximilian is now a quiet whisper, and you are once again a ghost in the annals of royal history. Your journey brings you back to the cold, formal grandeur of Imperial Russia, to the final tumultuous years of the Romanov dynasty. It is the early 20th century, a time of political unrest and a palpable sense of impending doom. You're a silent observer at the court of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra, a family whose lives were a testament to both immense power and profound personal tragedy. The royal curse, you will see, was not just a historical footnote. It was a living, breathing reality for this family, a shadow that clung to their son, the heir, and would ultimately contribute to their downfall. The family's most famous medical tragedy, a mainstream historical fact, was their son, Alexei Nikolaevich, the Tsarevich, and his haemophilia. This debilitating genetic disease, inherited from his great-grandmother Queen Victoria, made him a fragile, sickly child. A simple bump or fall could lead to internal bleeding, excruciating pain, and a life-threatening crisis. The court, in its desperation, turned to the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin, a man who, to the astonishment of the doctors, seemed to be able to ease the boy's suffering. But while haemophilia was the more visible and dramatic illness, the curse of consumption, you will see, was also a constant and insidious presence in their lives. Empress Alexandra, a woman of deep religious conviction and a fragile mental state, was a constant source of anxiety. She was, by all accounts, a woman of immense intelligence and compassion, but her life was a series of battles, and the one against her own body was a constant and relentless one. She suffered from a variety of chronic health issues, including what she called heart trouble, a vague and often used diagnosis that, could have been a cover for something more sinister. She was also a woman of immense emotional stress, and her constant worry over her son's haemophilia would have weakened her immune system and made her particularly susceptible to the family's long-standing curse. The Tsar, Nicholas II, a man of quiet dignity and a deep sense of duty, was also not immune. He was, by all accounts, a healthy and robust man, but his family's history was a constant source of worry. The deaths of his uncle and cousin from consumption, you'll recall from previous sections, would have been a stark reminder of the curse's reach. He was a man who was fighting a losing battle against political forces he couldn't control, and the added burden of a family plagued by illness would have been an immense source of stress. The Tsar's life, you realise, was a series of battles, and the one against his own family's health was one that he was destined to lose. This brings you back to the Tsarevich, Alexei. While haemophilia was his most well-known illness, the family's doctors were also concerned about a different kind of wasting sickness. A quirky tidbit from the era is that the physicians of the court, in their medical journals and private correspondence, often mentioned their concern that the Tsarevich, with his weak constitution and constant fevers, could also be a victim of consumption. The two diseases, while unrelated, could have had a devastating synergy. A consumptive infection would have made his haemophilia worse, and the constant stress of his haemophilia would have made him more susceptible to the disease. It was a vicious cycle, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that seemed to follow the family wherever they went. The family's isolation from the outside world, a direct result of their paranoia and the political turmoil of the era, only made things worse. They lived in a gilded cage, a place where the air, while clean in some respects, was also stagnant and filled with the germs of the few people who were allowed into their inner circle. The palace, you realise, was not a sanctuary. It was a petri dish, a place where a single sickness could fester and spread with alarming speed. The doctors, in their desperation, tried a variety of bizarre and ineffective remedies, from sending the family to the fresh air of the Crimea to a series of religious rituals and prayers. It was all a futile attempt to ward off an invisible enemy they couldn't comprehend. Historians still argue about the exact role that consumption played in the final years of the Romanov dynasty. What is clear is that the constant anxiety over Alexei's health, and the health of the family as a whole, was a major factor in their downfall. It was this anxiety that led them to Rasputin, a man who, while a source of comfort to the Empress, was a source of political turmoil for the nation. It was this anxiety that led them to become isolated from the rest of the world, a move that would ultimately make them more vulnerable to the political revolution that was brewing just outside their palace walls. The curse, you see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a family, a series of tragedies that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The final act of the Romanov tragedy came in 1918, a brutal and bloody execution in the cellar of a house in Yekaterinburg. Their deaths were not from consumption, but from a political revolution that was, in many ways, a direct result of their personal tragedies. The curse, you realise, was not about who would live and die. It was about how a disease could destabilise a nation, plunge it into crisis, and leave a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. The Romanov family was, in many ways, the culmination of all the tragedies you have witnessed. They were a family who had everything, only to lose it all to a combination of political turmoil and a series of illnesses that no one could understand. As you leave the silent, haunted halls of the Romanov dynasty, you carry with you the memory of a family who, despite their immense power, were utterly helpless in the face of a curse that had plagued their family for centuries. Their story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you back to the heart of the Habsburg Empire, to a woman who, more than any other, seem to embody the tragic, almost poetic nature of the royal curse. The ghost of the Romanovs' tragic fate still lingers in the air, a chilling reminder of how personal curses can intertwine with geopolitical downfall. Your journey now takes you back to the very heart of the Habsburg Empire, to the Vienna of the late 19th century, a city of grand balls, artistic innovation, and a deep-seated melancholia. Your focus is on Empress Elizabeth, the legendary Sisi, a woman of ethereal beauty and a fiercely independent spirit who, more than any other royal, seemed to embody the romantic and tragic spirit of the age. She was, in many ways, the perfect victim of the royal curse, a woman who was not consumed by the disease itself, but by a lifetime of anxiety and grief caused by it, and the very culture that romanticised it. Empress Elizabeth was a woman who was deeply unhappy with the rigid, formal life of the Austrian court. She found solace in travel, in poetry, and in a constant, almost obsessive pursuit of physical perfection. She was known for her tiny waist, her long, flowing hair, and her aversion to public life. But what the public didn't see was the constant, gnawing anxiety that followed her wherever she went. She was a woman who was hyper-aware of her own mortality, and the mortality of her children, a woman who had seen firsthand the devastating effects of the Great White Plague. She was, in many ways, a woman who was living in a perpetual state of mourning, a black-clad ghost who haunted the palaces of Europe. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that consumption was a disease that was deeply intertwined with the romantic and artistic movements of the time. The pale skin, the feverish flush, the slender frame, all of them were seen not as signs of sickness, but of a heightened, almost ethereal beauty. This consumptive chic, as it was sometimes called, was a cultural phenomenon that Empress Elizabeth, with her delicate beauty and her melancholy spirit, seemed to embody. She was a woman who was, in many ways, a living work of art, but it was an art that was born of a deep-seated fear and a tragic reality. Her children, like their Habsburg predecessors, were also victims of the family's genetic vulnerabilities. You'll remember from a previous section, her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, met his tragic end at Mayerling, a death that may have been hastened by consumption. The death of her son was a profound shock to the Empress, a blow from which she would never recover. It was a clear and public reminder that the curse was still at work, a silent and methodical killer that had now taken her only son. Her life, which was already a series of battles against her own mental and physical health, was now a constant, unrelenting struggle against grief and despair. But the curse, you'll see, was not done with her yet. Her sister, Sophie Charlotte, the Duchess of Alençon, was a woman of vibrant beauty and a deep love for life, but she too was a victim of the family's curse. She was a woman who suffered from a series of respiratory illnesses, and her health was a constant source of concern for her family. A quirky tidbit from this time is that the Empress, in her desperation to save her sister, tried to convince her to join her on her endless travels, believing that a change of scenery and fresh air would somehow cure her. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. Sophie Charlotte died in a fire at a charity bazaar in Paris in 1897, a tragic and untimely end that many believe was a mercy. Her life, you realise, was a series of battles against a disease that was slowly and agonisingly consuming her. Historians still argue whether Empress Elizabeth herself was a consumptive. What is clear is that her life was a constant battle against a variety of ailments, both physical and mental. She suffered from what we would now call anorexia, a disease that was a product of her obsessive pursuit of physical perfection and her deep-seated fear of aging and death. She was also a woman who was plagued by a relentless cough, a symptom that she tried to hide from the public and the court. Her life was a series of masks and disguises, a desperate attempt to hide the fact that she was a woman who was slowly being consumed from the inside out. The Empress's death, when it came, was not from consumption, but from an assassin's knife in Geneva in 1898. It was a shocking and violent end to a life that had been a series of battles against disease, depression, and the crushing weight of her royal life. But her death, you realise, was in many ways a release. She was a woman who was already a ghost, a woman who was living a life that was a constant, unrelenting struggle against a world that she could not control. Her death was a tragic and violent end, but it was also a final, merciful release from a life that had been a constant, unrelenting battle against the royal curse. The story of Empress Elizabeth is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a woman, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. Her life, so full of promise and beauty, was snuffed out by a combination of political violence and a personal struggle against a disease that no one could understand. Her story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. As you leave the silent, haunted halls of the Habsburg Empire, you carry with you the memory of a woman who, more than any other, seemed to embody the tragic, almost poetic nature of the royal curse. Her story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you back to Imperial France, to a prince who seemed to have everything, only to be consumed by the same invisible killer. The ghost of Empress Elizabeth, with her tragic beauty and her endless grief, now fades into the mists of history. Your journey, a relentless march through royal tragedy, now brings you to a different empire, one that was built on the ashes of the French Revolution. It is the mid-19th century, the era of Emperor Napoleon III, a man who, like his famous uncle, sought to restore the glory of France. But even his immense ambition and political cunning could not protect his family from the royal curse. Your focus is on his only son, the Prince Imperial, a young man whose short life was a battle against both war and disease, and whose tragic death would be a final devastating blow to a dynasty that was already teetering on the brink of collapse. The Prince Imperial, born Napoleon Eugène Louis-Jean Joseph, was the heir to the French throne and the great hope of the Bonapartist dynasty. He was, by all accounts, a charming and intelligent young man, a figure of immense public fascination. But even in his youth, you, a silent observer with the knowledge of past centuries, see the familiar signs of the family's tragic history. His father, Napoleon III, had a history of health issues, and his mother, the beautiful and devoted Empress Eugénie, was a woman who was constantly worried about her son's health. The Prince Imperial, you realise, was a man with a target on his back from birth, a man whose genetic inheritance was both a blessing and a curse. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Bonapartist dynasty, while not as prone to intermarriage as the Habsburgs or the Spanish Bourbons, was still a family that was deeply affected by the curse of consumption. The disease was rampant in 19th century France, a country that was rapidly industrialising and urbanising, creating a perfect environment for the disease to spread. The French royal family, for all their wealth and privilege, was not immune. The Empress Eugénie, a woman of immense compassion, was deeply involved in charitable work, and she would have been exposed to the disease on a regular basis. Her anxiety over her son's health, you realise, was not just a mother's natural worry. It was a deep-seated fear born of a tragic reality. The Prince Imperial's life took a dramatic turn in 1870 with the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. His father, Napoleon III, a man who had dreamed of military glory, was defeated and captured, and the Second French Empire came to a swift and brutal end. The Prince Imperial and his mother were forced into exile, a move that would take them from the gilded halls of Paris to a modest home in England. The young prince, a man who had once been the heir to a great empire, was now a refugee, a prince without a crown. This sudden and brutal change in his life, you realise, would have had a profound effect on his physical and mental health. The disease, which had been a quiet companion in his life, now began to take a more active role. The stress of exile, the humiliation of his father's defeat, and the constant worry over his family's future all took a heavy toll on his health. He was plagued by fevers and a persistent dry cough that, you know, was a telltale sign of his underlying illness. The doctors, in their desperation, diagnosed him with a variety of ailments, but the truth, as it would later become clear, was far more sinister. The Prince Imperial was a man who was slowly and agonisingly being consumed by tuberculosis, a disease that, like the political situation in France, was eating him away from the inside out. Historians still argue whether the Prince Imperial was a consumptive. What is clear is that he was a man who was always living on the edge, a man whose life was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. A quirky tidbit from this time is that his mother, the Empress Eugénie, in her desperation to find a cure, became a fervent believer in the healing powers of the English climate. She would send her son to the countryside for extended periods of time, a practice that, while a beautiful and peaceful retreat, was utterly ineffective in combating the disease. She believed that the fresh air and the clean countryside would somehow cleanse his lungs and restore his health. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. His life, you realise, was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. The end came in 1879. The Prince Imperial, in a desperate attempt to prove his worth and to restore the glory of his family, had joined the British military and was sent to fight in the Anglo-Zulu War in South Africa. It was a dangerous and ill-advised mission, a final, foolhardy act of a man who was already living on borrowed time. He was killed in a surprise attack by Zulu warriors, a brutal and violent end to a life that had been a series of battles against disease, depression, and the crushing weight of his royal life. His death was a profound shock to his mother and to the nations of Europe. It was a final, devastating blow to a dynasty that was already teetering on the brink of collapse. The death of the Prince Imperial, you realise, was a tragic and ironic end to a life that had been a constant struggle against a disease that was slowly consuming him. He was a man who had fought a war, only to be killed in a conflict that was, in many ways, a direct result of his own family's political ambitions. His story is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was a personal and deeply painful reality for the people who lived it. It was a story of a man whose life was a series of battles, a man who was, in many ways, a ghost even before his death. As you leave the grounds of the British military camp in South Africa, you carry with you the image of a young prince, a man whose life was a testament to both ambition and tragedy. His story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you back to the heart of the British Empire, to a princess who seemed to have everything, only to be consumed by the same invisible killer. The echoes of the Prince Imperial's tragic end in the dusty hills of South Africa fade, and your relentless journey through royal tragedy now brings you back to the heart of the British Empire, to a woman who, in many ways, was the embodiment of grace and duty. It is the late 19th century, the era of Queen Victoria's reign, but your focus is on her daughter-in-law, Princess Alexandra of Denmark, the future Queen of England. She was a woman of breathtaking beauty and immense public adoration, but her life, you will see, was a series of battles against a debilitating illness that, for many years, was mistaken for the very curse you have been tracing. Her story is a poignant reminder that not every royal tragedy was the result of consumption, but that the fear of the disease was so pervasive it could cast a long, dark shadow over an entire life. Princess Alexandra, known as Alex to her family, was a woman who was adored by the British public from the moment she arrived in England. She was a figure of immense style and charisma, a woman who seemed to embody everything that was good and pure about the monarchy. But beneath the public persona was a woman who was constantly battling a mysterious and debilitating illness. She was a woman who, throughout her life, suffered from a series of fevers, a persistent cough, and a gradual but noticeable loss of hearing. These symptoms, you realise, were so similar to the early stages of consumption that they were a constant source of anxiety for her family and the court. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the medical community had very little understanding of the true causes of many diseases. They often relied on vague diagnoses and a variety of ineffective remedies. For Princess Alexandra, her doctors, in their desperation, diagnosed her with everything from rheumatic fever to a nervous disorder. The truth, as it would later become clear, was far more complex. Modern medical historians now believe that her illness was a form of otosclerosis, a disease of the inner ear that leads to hearing loss, and a form of arthritis that was the source of her fevers and joint pain. But in the 19th century, in a world where consumption was a constant and ever-present threat, the fear of the disease was so pervasive that it was the first thing to come to mind. The princess's illness was a source of immense anxiety for her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria. The Queen, a woman who had seen firsthand the devastating effects of the curse on her own family, was constantly worried that her daughter-in-law was a consumptive. She would write letters to her son, the Prince of Wales, a man who was already a constant source of worry, asking about his wife's health. She would send her own doctors to examine her, all in a desperate attempt to get a clear diagnosis. But the doctors, with their limited knowledge, could only offer a series of vague and unhelpful diagnoses. The Queen's fear, you realise, was not just a mother's natural worry. It was a deep-seated fear born of a tragic reality. The princess's health problems also had a profound effect on her relationship with her husband, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. He was a man of immense charm and a deep love for his wife, but he was also a man who was a constant source of scandal. His philandering, his love for gambling, and his general disregard for his public duties were a source of constant stress for the princess. She was a woman who was deeply devoted to her family and her public duties, but her constant battles with her own body made it difficult for her to keep up with the demands of her role. Her illness, you realise, was a constant source of tension and stress in her life, a silent and insidious companion that followed her wherever she went. A quirky tidbit from this time is that the princess, in her desperation to hide her hearing loss from the public, became a master of lip reading. She would spend hours practicing in front of a mirror, a skill that she would use for the rest of her life. She was a woman who was determined to not let her illness define her, a woman who was determined to be a source of strength and inspiration for her nation. But her illness, you realise, was a constant source of pain and humiliation, a silent and invisible struggle that no one could see. Her life, you realise, was a series of battles, and the one against her own body was one that she was destined to fight for the rest of her life. Historians still argue about the exact nature of her illness. What is clear is that her life was a constant battle against a variety of ailments, both physical and mental. She was a woman who was deeply unhappy with her husband's philandering, and her constant worry over her own health and the health of her children would have been an immense source of stress. She was a woman who was, in many ways, a living ghost, a woman who was living a life that was a constant, unrelenting struggle against a world that she could not control. Her story is a powerful reminder that not every royal tragedy was the result of consumption, but that the fear of the disease was so pervasive it could cast a long, dark shadow over an entire life. The princess's death, when it came in 1925, was not from consumption, but from a series of heart attacks. She was a woman who had lived a long and fruitful life, but it was a life that was a constant battle against a variety of ailments, both physical and mental. Her death was a tragic end to a life that had been a series of battles against disease, depression, and the crushing weight of her royal life. But her death, you realise, was in many ways a release. She was a woman who had fought a long and difficult battle, and her death was a final merciful release from a life that had been a constant, unrelenting struggle against the royal curse. As you leave the grounds of Marlborough House, the home of the princess, you carry with you the memory of a woman whose life was a testament to both grace and tragedy. Her story is a powerful reminder that the royal curse was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonising destruction of a woman, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The stage, you realise, is now set for the next chapter, one that will take you to the heart of the Portuguese royal family, to a dynasty that was, in many ways, a final brutal victim of the royal curse. The phantom of Princess Alexandra's quiet suffering fades, and your final tragic journey through royal history brings you to a small, proud kingdom on the edge of Europe. It is the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and you are a ghost in the royal court of Portugal, a dynasty that, more than any other, seemed to be a final brutal victim of the royal curse. This is the house of Braganza, Saxe, Coburg and Gotha, a family that was decimated by consumption in a series of heartbreaking, untimely deaths, a tragedy that would not only destroy a dynasty, but would also plunge a nation into a state of political turmoil from which it would never truly recover. The curse, you will see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonising destruction of an entire way of life. The curse's most devastating strike against the Portuguese monarchy began with King Louis I, a man of immense personal charm and a deep love for the arts. He was, by all accounts, a man of robust health, but his family, you will see, was not. His wife, Queen Maria Pia of Savoy, was a woman of immense style and a deep devotion to her family. But her life, you will see, was a series of battles against a constant and ever-present threat. The disease, which had been a quiet companion in so many other royal families, was now a loud and brutal killer in the Portuguese court. Their eldest son, King Carlos I, was a man of immense physical stature and a deep love for his country. He was a man who, like his father, seemed to be immune to the curse. But his family, you will see, was not. His wife, Princess Amélie of Orléans, was a woman of great intelligence and a deep love for her family. But her life, you will see, was a series of battles against a constant and ever-present threat. The disease, which had been a quiet companion in so many other royal families, was now a loud and brutal killer in the Portuguese court. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Portuguese royal family, like so many other European dynasties, was a tangled web of marriages and alliances. This close intermarriage, while meant to consolidate power, had the unintended consequence of concentrating a genetic predisposition to a variety of diseases, including tuberculosis. The disease, which was rampant in 19th century Portugal, a country with a large and impoverished population, was a constant and ever-present threat. The royal family, for all their wealth and privilege, was not immune. The disease, you realise, was a silent and insidious killer that was slowly and methodically eating away at the very foundations of the Portuguese monarchy. The curse's most devastating strike came in the form of King Carlos III's youngest son, Infante Luís Filipe, Duke of Braganza. He was a young man of immense charm and a deep love for his country, a man who seemed destined for greatness. But even in his youth, you, a silent observer with the knowledge of past centuries, see the familiar signs of the family's tragic history. A certain frailty, a susceptibility to illness, and a cough that, while not yet persistent, was a nagging reminder of the family's tragic history. He was, in many ways, a mirror image of his more famous brother, a man who was destined for a life of both triumph and tragedy. The disease, which had been a quiet companion in his life, now began to take a more active role. The stress of his public duties, the constant worry over his family's future, and the political turmoil of the era all took a heavy toll on his health. He was plagued by fevers and a persistent dry cough that, was a telltale sign of his underlying illness. The doctors, in their desperation, diagnosed him with a variety of ailments, but the truth, as it would later become clear, was far more sinister. The Duke of Braganza was a man who was slowly and agonizingly being consumed by tuberculosis, a disease that, like the political situation in Portugal, was eating him away from the inside out. Historians still argue whether the Duke of Braganza was a consumptive. What is clear is that he was a man who was always living on the edge, a man whose life was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. A quirky tidbit from this time is that the royal family, in their desperation to find a cure, became a fervent believer in the healing powers of the Portuguese climate. They would send their consumptive royals to the seaside, a practice that, while a beautiful and peaceful retreat, was utterly ineffective in combating the disease. They believed that the warm sun and the clean sea air would somehow cleanse their lungs and restore their health. It was a beautiful idea, but it was, of course, a futile one. His life, you realise, was a series of battles, and the one against his own body was one that he was destined to lose. The end came in 1908. The king, his eldest son, and the Duke of Braganza were assassinated in an open carriage in Lisbon. It was a shocking and violent end to a dynasty that was already teetering on the brink of collapse. The death of the king and his heir was a final devastating blow to a family that was already being consumed by the royal curse. The death of the Duke of Braganza, you realise, was a tragic and ironic end to a life that had been a constant struggle against a disease that was slowly consuming him. He was a man who had fought a war, only to be killed in a conflict that was, in many ways, a direct result of his own family's political ambitions. The death of the king and his heir, you realise, was a tragic and ironic end to a life that had been a constant struggle against a disease that was slowly consuming him. The political turmoil that followed their deaths would lead to the end of the Portuguese monarchy in 1910. The royal curse, you realise, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonising destruction of a family, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The story of the Portuguese royal family is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. As you leave the silent, haunted streets of Lisbon, you carry with you the memory of a family who, despite their immense power, were utterly helpless in the face of a curse that had plagued their family for centuries. Their story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The stage, you realise, is now set for the final chapter. one that will tie together all the stories you have witnessed, a final reflection on the profound and lasting impact of the royal curse. The echoes of the Portuguese monarchy's final, violent moments fade, and you're now a witness to the culmination of all the stories you have experienced. You have travelled through centuries and across continents, a phantom in the gilded halls and sombre chambers of Europe's most powerful families. You have seen the curse of consumption, the Great White Plague, the wasting sickness, infiltrate the very fabric of power, claiming its victims with a chilling, methodical cruelty. This final section is not about a new tragedy, but a reflection on the profound and lasting impact of the disease on the 10 royals whose stories you have witnessed. It is a moment to tie all these threads together, to see how the crown and the curse were inextricably linked. A cruel, an unrelenting partnership that would shape the course of history. You remember Princess Mary Tudor, whose fragile childhood in the court of Henry VIII was our starting point. Her chronic illness, whether a direct result of consumption or a weakened constitution, was the first sign of the curse at work. It fueled her father's desperate quest for a male heir, a mainstream historical fact that led to the English Reformation. The curse, you see, was not just a personal affliction for Mary. It was a political force that would reshape a nation. It was a silent, insidious agitator that would undermine a king's ambition and set the stage for a dynastic crisis. Then you witnessed the short, heartbreaking reign of Edward VI, the boy king whose fate was sealed by the very disease that plagued his family. His death, a clear case of consumption, plunged England into chaos, leading to the brief and tragic reign of Lady Jane Grey and the eventual ascension of Mary the Womb. The curse, you realise, was a puppet master, pulling the strings of succession and dictating the religious and political future of an entire nation. His story is a poignant reminder that no amount of power or privilege could protect a monarch from this one universal killer. You journeyed to the opulent court of Louis XIV at Versailles, where the glamour of royalty hid the slow, wasting illness of his closest family members. You saw how the disease claimed his daughter-in-law, Marie-Anne Christine, and how it would later decimate 3 generations of heirs, a devastating blow to the Bourbon dynasty. The curse, you realise, was a silent destroyer, a phantom that moved through the palace, touching one person and sparing another, its motives unknowable, its reach terrifying. The whispers in the halls of Versailles, you will remember, continued into the reign of Louis XV, where the glamour of royalty hid the slow, wasting illness of his closest family members. The deaths of his daughter, Louise Elizabeth, and his son, the Dauphin Louis, were a series of devastating blows to the monarchy. The curse, you see, was not just a medical problem, it was a political one. It was a disease that could destabilise a nation, plunge it into crisis, and leave a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. The deaths of these 2 royals, you realise, were a silent prelude to the French Revolution, a final, brutal end to a dynasty that was already being consumed from the inside out. The star-crossed lovers of Prussia, Princess Louise and Prince Karl, showed you the personal side of the curse. Their love story, so bright and beautiful, was a small flame that was snuffed out by a disease that no one could understand. Their tragedy is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would claim not just one life, but 2. The curse, you see, was not just about death, it was about the slow, agonising destruction of a family, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The Tsar's daughter and the whispering sickness, Grand Duchess Alexandra of Russia, was a heartbreaking tale of a young woman fading away in a foreign land. Her death, a clear case of consumption, was a tragic and ironic end to a life that had been a constant struggle against a world that had rejected her. The curse, you realise, was a political force, a silent agitator that could undermine diplomatic alliances and create lasting resentment between nations. The death of one young princess, so far from home, had a ripple effect that was felt across the continent. The beautiful queen and the deadly kiss, Princess Alice, was a powerful reminder of the human cost of the Great White Plague. Her life, a testament to both love and tragedy, was a constant battle against a variety of ailments, both physical and mental. Her death, a final, merciful release from a life that had been a constant, unrelenting struggle against the royal curse. Her story is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. The Empress's Son and the Secret of Mayerling, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, showed you how the curse could be intertwined with scandal and political intrigue. His death, a murder-suicide that may have been hastened by consumption, was a final, foolhardy act of a man who was already living on borrowed time. The curse, you see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a man, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The shadow on the sceptre of Spain, King Alfonso XII, was a powerful illustration of the cyclical nature of the royal curse. It was a disease that ran in families, a slow and methodical killer that seemed to move from one generation to the next. His death, a clear case of advanced tuberculosis, plunged Spain into a succession crisis. The curse, you realise, was not just a medical problem, it was a political one. It was a disease that could destabilise a nation, plunge it into crisis, and leave a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. The last emperor of Mexico's brother, Archduke Maximilian, was a powerful reminder that the royal curse was a global phenomenon. His death, a brutal and violent end to a life that had been a series of battles against war and disease, was a final, tragic end to a dynasty that was already teetering on the brink of collapse. The curse, you see, was not just about death. It was about the slow, agonizing destruction of a man, a series of battles that seemed to follow one another with a chilling inevitability. The story of the 10 royals you have witnessed is a powerful reminder that the crown and the curse were inextricably linked, a cruel and unrelenting partnership that would continue to claim victims for centuries to come. They were men and women of immense power and privilege, but they were also human, vulnerable to the same diseases that plagued the rest of the world. The curse, you realise, was not just a historical footnote, it was a living, breathing reality for these families, a shadow that clung to them wherever they went. It was a story of a disease that could destabilise a nation, plunge it into crisis, and leave a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. The final act of the royal curse, you realise, was not just about death, it was about the slow, agonising destruction of an entire way of life. Now, as the stories fade and the shadows of these royal ghosts recede, I want you to close your eyes. Let the images of their struggles, their triumphs and their tragedies dissolve into the quiet hum of your room. The grand halls, the whispered conspiracies, the silent suffering. They're all a part of history now, a history that is as much about the human condition as it is about power. Feel the cool air on your skin and the soft pulse of your own heart, a heart that is not burdened by a crown or a curse. The night is deep and the world outside is still. You are safe here, in this moment, in this quiet sanctuary. There is no plague, no conspiracy, just the peaceful rhythm of your own breathing. Let yourself drift. The journey is over, but the stories, the quiet, gentle whispers of the past will always be there. They are a part of us now, a reminder that even in the greatest of tragedies, there is a quiet beauty to be found. Sleep now, and let the rest come. You have earned it.